Elira ran through the dark trees with her heart slamming against her ribs. Branches tore at her sleeves, and the cold night air burned her throat, but she did not stop. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the brush, and low growls that did not sound human at all. She had not meant to cross the old stone marker at the edge of the forest. She had only been trying to find a shortcut home, after selling the last of her mother's medicine herbs at the market. But the marker meant something in this land. It meant she had stepped onto territory that belonged to the Blackthorn Pack, land where ordinary people were never allowed to walk after dark. Her foot caught on a root and she stumbled, scraping her palms against the frozen ground. She pushed herself up quickly, glancing over her shoulder. Two shapes moved between the trees, faster than any man should be able to move. She knew what they were. Everyone in her village knew the stories, whispered around fires late at night. Wolves that were not wolves. Guards that could tear a trespasser apart before sunrise, and leave nothing behind for the family to bury. Elira forced her legs to keep moving, though her lungs screamed for rest. She thought of her mother, waiting at home with a fever that would not break, waiting for the herbs Elira had promised to bring back. She thought of her younger brother, too small to understand why his sister might never come home. Fear was not new to her, but this kind of fear, sharp and immediate, made her whole body shake. She broke through a line of trees and found herself in a wide, moonlit clearing. Too late, she realized her mistake. There was nowhere left to run. Stone walls rose ahead of her, tall and ancient, the outer boundary of the Blackthorn Castle grounds. She had run in the wrong direction entirely. She had run toward the heart of the danger, instead of away from it. The footsteps behind her stopped. The growling stopped too. Elira turned slowly, pressing her back against the cold stone wall, waiting for teeth and claws to end everything. But nothing came. Instead, a tall figure stepped out from the shadow of the wall, only a few feet from her. He was not one of the beasts that had chased her. He looked like a man, dressed in a long dark coat, his face calm in a way that made her more afraid, not less. His eyes caught the moonlight, pale gray and unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You should not be here," he said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something heavy and tired that did not match the coldness of his words. Elira's mouth was dry. She had heard of him only in fragments, never his true face. The Alpha King. The cursed ruler of Blackthorn, a man that people spoke of only in careful whispers, afraid that saying his name too loudly might bring bad luck upon their own homes. Some said he had killed his own family. Others said the gods themselves had marked him for solitude, that anyone who loved him would suffer for it. She had always thought these were just old stories meant to frighten children. Standing before him now, she was no longer sure. "I did not mean to cross the marker," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I was trying to get home. I am sorry." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was telling the truth. Behind him, in the dark tree line, she could still make out two shapes waiting, patient and silent, clearly under his command. "People who cross that marker do not usually get the chance to explain themselves," he said. "My guards are not known for their patience." "Then why am I still standing here?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. She saw a flicker of surprise cross his face, quickly hidden again. "That is a fair question," he said. He did not answer it directly. Instead, he took a step closer, studying her muddy dress, the scrapes on her hands, the herbs still clutched tightly in a small cloth bag at her side. "What is so important that you would risk your life running through cursed land at night?" "My mother is sick," Elira said. "These herbs are the only medicine we can afford. I did not want to wait until morning." Something shifted in his expression, so small she almost missed it. Sympathy, perhaps, though he seemed unwilling to let it show for long. "Go home," he said finally. "Do not come this way again. Next time, my guards may not wait for my order." Elira did not need to be told twice. She pushed away from the wall and walked past him quickly, careful not to make any sudden movement that might change his mind. But just before she reached the tree line, she turned back, unable to stop herself. "Thank you," she said simply. He did not answer. He only watched her disappear into the trees, his pale eyes following her until the darkness swallowed her completely. By the time Elira reached her small cottage on the edge of the village, the sky had begun to turn a soft gray at the edges, the first hint of morning approaching. Her hands were shaking, though whether from the cold or from what had just happened, she could not tell. She pushed open the door quietly, not wanting to wake her brother, and found her mother lying by the fire, pale and trembling, under a thin blanket. "Elira," her mother whispered, her voice weak but relieved. "You are back. I was so worried." "I am here now," Elira said, kneeling beside her and pulling out the herbs. Her hands moved quickly, familiar with the process even in her exhaustion. She crushed the leaves, mixed them with warm water from the kettle still simmering over the low fire, and helped her mother drink the bitter medicine. "Where were you?" her mother asked, studying her daughter's torn sleeve and the dirt on her cheek. "You look as though you have been running from wolves." Elira hesitated. She thought of the pale eyes that had studied her in the clearing, of the guards waiting silently in the trees, of the cold stone walls of the castle, rising behind him like a warning. She thought of the strange calm in his voice, and the way his expression had softened, just slightly, when he learned why she had crossed the marker. "It is nothing," she said finally. "I lost my way in the dark, that is all." Her mother did not press further, too tired to argue, and soon drifted into an uneasy sleep. Elira sat beside her for a long while, staring into the dying fire, unable to shake the image of the man in the clearing from her mind. She told herself it did not matter. She would likely never see him again. The castle and its cursed king belonged to a world far removed from her own simple life of herbs and market stalls and a sick mother who needed care. And yet, something about the encounter refused to leave her thoughts. The following days passed in their usual rhythm. Elira worked in the small garden behind their cottage, tending to the herbs her family depended on for both medicine and income. She helped her brother, Peter, with his lessons in the evening, teaching him letters by candlelight since their family could not afford a proper tutor. She visited the market twice, selling what she could, always careful now to avoid the edge of the forest, always taking the longer path home before dark. But the village had its own rhythm of gossip, and it was not long before whispers of the king reached her ears in ways she did not expect. At the market one afternoon, an older woman named Margaret, who sold bread from a cart near the square, leaned close to Elira as she counted out coins. "Have you heard?" Margaret said, her voice hushed with the kind of excitement that comes from sharing forbidden knowledge. "One of the king's own advisors passed through the village yesterday, looking for workers willing to serve inside the castle. Kitchen staff, seamstresses, anyone with steady hands and a quiet mouth." "Why would anyone want to work there?" Elira asked, though her curiosity was suddenly sharper than she wanted to admit. "Everyone says the castle is cursed." Margaret shrugged, wrapping a loaf of bread in cloth. "The pay is generous, my dear. More than most of us see in a season of honest work. Fear does not fill empty stomachs, does it?" Elira thought of her mother's illness, of the cost of medicine that grew harder to afford with each passing month, of her brother's growing need for proper shoes and warmer clothes before winter arrived in full force. The thought of steady coin was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit even to herself. That night, as she lay awake staring at the low ceiling of her small room, she made a decision that surprised even her. In the morning, she would seek out this advisor and ask about the position, whatever it might be. She told herself it was only practical, only a matter of necessity for her family's sake. She refused to admit that some small part of her wondered whether such work might bring her back within reach of the castle, and the strange, tired eyes of the man who had let her walk free. The advisor, a stern-faced woman named Beatrice, found Elira the very next morning near the village well, exactly as Margaret had promised. She studied Elira carefully, taking note of her steady hands and calm manner, and asked a series of careful questions about her family, her skills, her willingness to follow strict rules of conduct within the castle walls. "The castle requires discretion," Beatrice said firmly. "You will see things, hear things, that are not meant to leave those walls. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elira said, though privately she wondered what kind of secrets a castle could hold that required such careful silence. "Report to the eastern gate at dawn tomorrow. You will be assigned to assist in the kitchens, at least for now. Do not be late, and do not wander where you are not permitted." Elira nodded, her pulse quickening with a mixture of nervousness and something that felt uncomfortably close to anticipation. As Beatrice walked away, Elira stood alone by the well for a long moment, staring toward the distant outline of the castle towers rising above the trees. She thought again of the pale eyes in the clearing, of the low, tired voice that had told her to go home. She wondered if she would see him again, and immediately scolded herself for the thought. She was going there to earn coin for her family, nothing more. The Alpha King, whoever and whatever he truly was, had no reason to concern himself with a kitchen worker from the village. And yet, as she walked home that afternoon to prepare for the following morning, she could not stop the small, quiet flutter of nervous excitement that stirred within her chest, a feeling she did not yet have a name for, but one that would soon change the entire course of her life. The eastern gate loomed larger than Alira had expected, its iron bars twisted into shapes that looked almost like reaching claws. She arrived just as the sky turned from black to deep blue, her breath visible in the cold morning air. A line of other new workers had already gathered, shifting nervously from foot to foot, none of them speaking above a whisper. A guard with a scarred jaw checked names off a list, barely glancing up as each person passed through the gate. When he called her name, Alira stepped forward, trying to steady her breathing. The guard studied her for a moment longer than the others, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he recognized something about her, though he said nothing, and waved her through. Inside the walls, the castle rose before her like something out of an old story, gray stones stretching up into towers that disappeared into the morning mist. Servants moved briskly across the courtyard, carrying baskets of linens and crates of vegetables, none of them making eye contact with the new arrivals. The air itself felt different here, heavier somehow, as though the stones remembered things that had happened within them. A woman named Clara, the head of the kitchen staff, met the new workers just inside the servants' entrance. She was short and quick-moving, with flour permanently dusted across her apron, and she wasted no time explaining the rules. "You work, you eat, you sleep," Clara said briskly, walking them through a maze of narrow stone corridors. "You do not wander past the kitchen halls unless given permission. You do not speak of the king unless spoken to first, and you never, under any circumstance, enter the West Wing. Is that understood?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Alira nodded along with the others, though her mind lingered on the mention of the West Wing, wondering what secrets it might hold that required such a strict warning. The kitchen itself was enormous, filled with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread, copper pots hanging from thick wooden beams overhead. Alira was set to work almost immediately, chopping vegetables alongside a girl named Nora, who seemed close to her own age, and far more talkative than the stern Clara. "You are new," Nora said, not looking up from her own chopping. "I can always tell. The new ones move too carefully, as if the floor might swallow them whole." "Is it really as dangerous here as everyone in the village says?" Alira asked quietly, keeping her voice low enough that Clara would not overhear. Nora glanced around before answering, lowering her voice to match Alira's. "The king keeps to himself, mostly. Some of the older staff say he has not smiled in years. There was a time, long ago, when he had a mate. Before I came to work here, she died within a season of their bonding. Some illness, they say, though no one knows for certain. After that, no one dared get close to him again." "Do you believe the curse is real?" Alira asked. Nora shrugged, tossing chopped carrots into a large pot. "I believe enough people have died around him that it does not matter whether it is a curse or simple bad fortune. The result is the same either way. Best to keep your head down and your questions to yourself, especially when it comes to him." Alira nodded, filing the information away, though she found herself unable to stop turning it over in her mind throughout the long day of work. She thought of the tired sadness she had glimpsed behind his cold exterior in the clearing, the way his voice had softened just slightly when he learned about her sick mother. It did not match the image of a monster that the village stories painted, nor did it entirely match the image of a man cursed by fate itself. He seemed, more than anything, simply lonely. Days passed in a similar rhythm. Alira woke before dawn, worked long hours in the kitchen, and fell into an exhausted sleep each night in the small shared quarters given to the kitchen staff. She sent coin home to her family whenever she was given leave to visit the village, relieved to see her mother's health slowly improving and her brother growing steadier on his feet with proper food and warmer clothes. She did not see the king during those first 2 weeks, though his presence seemed to linger over the entire castle like an invisible weight. Staff members lowered their voices whenever his name was mentioned. Guards straightened their posture whenever rumors spread that he was walking through a particular hallway. Even Clara, usually so brisk and unbothered, grew noticeably quieter on the rare occasions when his schedule brought him near the kitchen halls. Then, on a cold evening nearly 3 weeks into her employment, everything changed. Elira had been sent to deliver a tray of tea to one of the smaller sitting rooms near the Eastern Hall, a task usually given to more senior staff. But Clara was occupied with a kitchen crisis involving a burned batch of bread meant for an important dinner. Elira balanced the tray carefully, following the directions Clara had given her, weaving through unfamiliar corridors lit by flickering torchlight. She pushed open the door to the sitting room and stopped short. The king sat alone by a tall window, staring out at the darkening grounds below, a single candle burning on the table beside him. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Recognition flickered across his face, sharp and immediate. "You," he said quietly. Elira's hands trembled slightly as she set the tray down on a nearby table, unsure whether to apologize, explain, or simply retreat as quickly as possible. "I did not know this room was assigned to you, my lord. I can bring someone else if you prefer." "No," he said, standing slowly. "Stay a moment." She froze, uncertain, watching as he studied her with the same intensity he had shown in the clearing weeks before. "You work in the kitchens now," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, my lord. I needed steady work, to help my family." "Your mother," he said. "Is she well?" Elira blinked, surprised he remembered such a small detail from their brief encounter. "She is much improved, thank you for asking." Something in his expression shifted again, that same flicker of warmth quickly hidden beneath a more careful, controlled mask. He walked closer, and Elira noticed, for the first time in proper light, the deep tiredness etched into the lines around his eyes, the weight of years of solitude carried in every careful movement. "Most people who cross my path do not thank me," he said. "They fear me. They avoid my eyes. They pray I will forget their existence entirely." "Should I fear you?" Elira asked before she could stop herself. He seemed to consider the question seriously, rather than dismissing it. "Many believe they should. My history is not a kind one. Those who grow close to me tend to suffer for it." "I have heard the stories," Elira admitted, "about the curse. And do you believe them?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I believe you have suffered great loss, my lord. Whether that is due to a curse or simple misfortune, I could not say. But I do not believe a man becomes what the village stories describe, simply because he has known sorrow." For a long moment, he said nothing, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. Then, unexpectedly, something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You speak more freely than anyone in this castle has dared to in a very long time," he said. "It is either remarkable bravery or remarkable foolishness. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps it is a little of both, my lord." This time, the almost smile lingered slightly longer before fading. "Return to your duties," he said, though his voice carried none of the coldness it had held during their first meeting. "But I find I would not object to seeing you again." Elira curtsied quickly and left the room, her heart pounding, for entirely different reasons than the fear that had driven her through the forest weeks before. As she made her way back to the kitchens, she replayed the conversation over and over in her mind, trying to understand the strange mixture of caution and curiosity stirring within her. The following morning, Clara approached her with an announcement that left the entire kitchen staff whispering in surprise. "You have been requested for reassignment," Clara said, studying Elira with an expression somewhere between suspicion and concern. "Effective immediately, you will serve as personal attendant to His Majesty, assisting with meals, correspondence, and daily matters within his private quarters." Nora, standing nearby, nearly dropped the tray she was carrying, staring at Elira with wide eyes. Whispers spread quickly through the kitchen staff, some filled with envy at the prestigious position, others with clear worry for what such closeness to the cursed king might mean for a simple village girl. "Is something wrong?" Elira asked Clara quietly, noticing the older woman's troubled expression. Clara hesitated before answering, lowering her voice so only Elira could hear. "No one has served that close to him in years, not since his last mate passed. Be careful, child. Whatever draws his attention to you, guard yourself carefully. The last people who grew close to that man did not fare well." Elira nodded, though the warning did little to ease the strange mixture of excitement and apprehension building within her chest. As she gathered her few belongings and prepared to move into the quarters nearer the king's private wing, she could not shake the feeling that her life, once so simple and predictable, was about to change in ways she could not yet fully understand. That evening, as she stood outside the heavy wooden doors leading to the king's private chambers, gathering her courage before her first official duty, Alira thought back to the terrified girl who had run through the dark forest weeks earlier, certain her life was about to end. She had never imagined that same night would lead her here, standing on the edge of a world so far removed from her own, drawn toward a man that everyone else in the kingdom feared to even look upon directly. She took a steadying breath, straightened her shoulders, and pushed open the door. The private chambers of King Alaric Vane were unlike anything Alira had imagined. She had expected grandeur, perhaps even excess, given his position and power. Instead, she found a space that felt strangely bare, almost hollow, as though no one had truly lived within it for a long time. Tall shelves lined one wall, filled with books that looked untouched by dust, and a large fireplace crackled quietly at the far end of the room, its light barely reaching the shadowed corners. Alaric sat at a heavy wooden desk, papers spread before him, though he looked up the moment she entered. "You came," he said, as though he had half expected her to refuse the assignment entirely. "I was told it was not a request I could decline, my lord," Alira said carefully, setting down the small tray of tea she had carried up from the kitchens out of habit. "That is true," he admitted, "though if you had strong objections, I would have arranged something else. I do not force people to remain close to me against their will." "I have no objections," Alira said, surprising herself with how quickly and honestly the words came. "Only questions, if I may be permitted to ask them." He gestured toward a chair near the fire, an invitation that seemed to cost him something, as though the simple act of allowing someone to sit comfortably in his presence went against long-practiced habit. "Ask, then." "Why me?" she said, settling into the chair. "There must be dozens of staff members more experienced than I am, more suited to such a position." Alaric set down his pen, considering the question with the same seriousness he had shown during their conversation in the sitting room. "Experience is not what I require," he said finally. "I require someone who does not flinch when I speak, someone who does not lower their eyes the moment I enter a room. You are the first person in a very long time who has looked at me and seen a man, rather than a legend meant to frighten children." Alira absorbed this in silence, understanding for the first time the true depth of the isolation he must have endured. To be surrounded by people, yet treated as something untouchable, something dangerous simply by existing, seemed a lonelier fate than being entirely alone. "The stories in the village say terrible things," she admitted, "that you brought misfortune to your own parents, that anyone who loves you is doomed to suffer." His expression darkened slightly, though not with anger. "My parents died when I was young, shortly after my birth. An illness swept through the pack that spring, one that spared almost no one in its path. It happened to take them both within days of each other. The pack elders, desperate for an explanation that made sense of such tragedy, decided it must have been a curse tied to my birth, rather than simple, cruel chance." "And your mate?" Alira asked gently, though she was unsure whether the question crossed a boundary she should not have approached. Something flickered across his face, old grief carefully contained, but not entirely hidden. "Seraphine," he said quietly. "She was kind, gentle, in ways I did not deserve. We were bonded only a few months before illness took her as well. After that, the stories grew louder, more certain. The cursed king, they called me, doomed to bring death to anyone foolish enough to love him." "Do you believe it yourself?" Alira asked. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I have tried not to," he said finally. "But it becomes difficult to ignore a pattern that repeats itself so precisely, so many times. I have spent years keeping people at a distance, telling myself it was for their protection, rather than my own comfort." Alira considered his words carefully, choosing her own with equal care. "Grief and loneliness can make coincidence feel like fate, my lord. Illness took your parents. Illness took your mate. These are terrible things, but they are not unique to you alone. Many families suffer such losses without any curse to explain them." "You speak as though it were simple," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only a weary kind of curiosity. "I do not believe anything about your life has been simple," she said, "but I do not believe you are cursed either. I believe you have been unlucky. and lonely, and that loneliness has convinced you that keeping everyone away is the only way to protect them. He studied her for a long time after that, an unreadable expression settling across his features. "You are either the bravest person I have met in years," he said finally, "or the only one honest enough to speak such thoughts aloud in my presence. Perhaps it is simply that I have less to lose than most," Elira said with a small, tired smile. A kitchen worker from a poor village does not have the luxury of choosing her words as carefully as a courtier might. For the first time since she had known him, Alaric laughed, a low, rough sound, as though the action itself was unfamiliar to him. It transformed his face entirely, softening the hard lines that seemed permanently etched there, and Elira found herself smiling in response before she could stop herself. Over the following days, Elira settled into her new role within the castle, discovering that her duties, while demanding, were far less frightening than she had anticipated. She managed his correspondence, organized his meals according to the schedule Clara provided from the kitchens, and found herself present during many of his quiet evening hours, when the weight of ruling an entire pack seemed to settle most heavily upon his shoulders. She learned, gradually, the smaller details of his daily life. He preferred his tea without sugar, a habit from childhood he could not fully explain. He read late into the night, often long after the rest of the castle had gone quiet, as though sleep itself brought memories he preferred to avoid. He rarely ventured beyond the castle grounds, though she noticed a longing in his eyes whenever he watched the distant mountains from his window, as though some part of him wished for a freedom his position denied him. In turn, he learned details of her own life, small pieces she offered carefully, uncertain how much of herself to share with a man so far removed from her own simple world. She told him of her mother's illness, slowly improving with proper medicine and rest. She told him of her brother, eager to learn despite their family's limited means. She told him, hesitantly, of her father, who had died several years earlier in an accident while working timber deep in the forest, leaving her mother to raise 2 children largely on her own. "It seems we share a certain familiarity with loss," Alaric observed one evening, as they sat near the fire, the castle quiet around them. "Loss visits every family eventually," Alaric said. "Some simply carry heavier burdens than others." "Do you resent it?" he asked. "The unfairness of losing your father so young, of watching your mother struggle?" Elira considered the question honestly before answering. "I did, for a time. But resentment does not put food on the table, or medicine in reach. Eventually, I decided it was more useful to simply keep moving forward, rather than dwelling on what could not be changed." Alaric nodded slowly, something thoughtful in his expression. "A practical philosophy," he said. "I confess I have not always managed such practicality myself. Grief has a way of settling deep, refusing to loosen its grip easily." "Perhaps that is because you have carried yours alone for so long," Elira said gently. "Grief shared tends to weigh less than grief carried in solitude." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her breath catch slightly in her chest. "Is that an offer, Elira? To share the weight?" She held his gaze, surprised by her own steadiness in that moment. "Perhaps it is, my lord." Neither of them spoke further on the matter that evening, though something had shifted subtly between them, a quiet acknowledgement of a connection neither had expected nor entirely understood. As Elira returned to her own small quarters later that night, she found herself smiling softly into the darkness, aware that something important had begun, even if neither of them yet understood exactly where it might lead. Word of her closeness to the king spread quickly through the castle staff, carried on whispers between kitchen workers and guards alike. Some regarded her with newfound respect, believing her influence might soften the cold reputation their ruler had carried for so long. Others watched her with clear worry, remembering the fate of those who had grown close to him before, and wondering whether history was destined to repeat itself once again. Nora, in particular, seemed torn between excitement and concern whenever Elira returned to visit the kitchens during her rare hours of leave. "Everyone is talking about you," Nora said one afternoon, kneading dough with unusual energy. "They say the king has not laughed within these walls in over a decade, yet the guards outside his study swear they have heard him do so twice this week alone." "People exaggerate," Elira said, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite her attempt at modesty. "Perhaps," Nora said, though her expression grew more serious. "Just be careful, Elira. Whatever is happening between you, The stories about him did not come from nowhere. Elira nodded, though privately she found it harder each day to reconcile the cold, cursed figure of village legend with the quietly thoughtful, deeply lonely man she had come to know within the castle walls. She did not yet know where this growing connection would lead, but she found, to her own surprise, that she was no longer afraid to find out. A scream echoed through the servant corridor just before dawn, sharp and sudden enough to jolt Elira from her sleep. She sat upright, heart pounding, listening as footsteps thundered past her small quarters, voices raised in alarm. She threw on her shawl and hurried into the hallway, joining the growing crowd of frightened staff gathering near the entrance to the kitchen storerooms. One of the younger kitchen girls, no older than 14, stood trembling near an overturned barrel of grain, her face pale as ash. "Rats," she stammered, though her wide eyes suggested something far more troubling than simple vermin. There were rats everywhere, hundreds of them, pouring out from beneath the floor. Clara pushed through the crowd, her expression tight with controlled alarm. "Everyone back to your duties," she ordered firmly, though Elira noticed her hands trembling slightly as she surveyed the scattered grain and torn sacks. "It is nothing more than an infestation. We will have it handled by midday." But whispers spread quickly regardless of Clara's reassurance. An infestation of such size, appearing so suddenly within the well-maintained castle storerooms, struck many of the older staff as deeply unnatural. Elira heard the word cursed murmured more than once as she made her way back toward her own duties, and found herself wondering, despite her earlier certainty, whether something darker than simple misfortune might truly be at work within these walls. She did not mention the incident to Alaric directly, uncertain how such news might affect him, though she suspected word would reach him regardless through his advisors. Sure enough, when she arrived for her evening duties, she found him standing rigidly by the window, his expression carved from stone. "You have heard, then," he said without turning, his voice carrying a heaviness she had not heard from him in days. "I heard there was an infestation in the storerooms," Elira said carefully. "Clara believes it will be handled quickly." "Clara does not understand what such things mean," Alaric said, finally turning to face her. His eyes, usually carefully controlled, held a rawness that surprised her. "Strange occurrences like this have preceded every tragedy in my life. My parents' illness began with a similarly sudden blight upon our crops. Before Seraphine fell ill, an entire flock of ravens dropped dead outside these very walls, with no explanation the healers could offer." Elira felt a chill settle over her, though she fought to keep her voice steady. "Coincidence can appear meaningful when we are searching for patterns, my lord. Storerooms are not immune to rats, regardless of who rules above them." "I want to believe that," he said quietly. "I truly do. But you must understand, Elira. The pattern has repeated too many times for me to dismiss it easily. I fear what growing closer to me might mean for you, should the curse prove real after all." "I am not afraid," Elira said firmly, though a small tremor of uncertainty stirred within her chest despite her words. "Perhaps you should be," Elaric said, his voice low. "I could not bear to watch history repeat itself again, not with you." The conversation left Elira unsettled, long after she returned to her quarters that night. She lay awake, staring at the shadows, dancing across the ceiling from her single candle, turning his words over in her mind. She refused to believe that simple chance could be twisted into some grand design of fate, yet the weight of his fear was difficult to ignore entirely. The following days brought further strange occurrences, small at first, easy to dismiss individually, but growing increasingly difficult to ignore when considered together. A section of the castle roof collapsed without warning during a routine inspection, injuring one of the guards, though thankfully not fatally. The well within the courtyard ran suddenly dry for 2 full days, before mysteriously refilling on its own. Several of the older pack members, those who had served the castle since Alaric's father's time, began quietly murmuring about omens and warnings, their voices tight with old fear. Elira noticed Alaric growing more withdrawn with each incident, retreating further behind the careful walls he had begun to lower during their earlier conversations. He cancelled several of their evening discussions entirely, citing pressing matters of pack governance, though Elira suspected the truth ran deeper than simple busyness. She found him one evening in the castle's small private library, a room she had not yet entered during her time serving him. He sat surrounded by old books and scrolls, his expression exhausted, dark circles forming beneath his eyes from clearly restless nights. "You are avoiding me," Elira said quietly. stepping into the room despite the obvious tension in his posture. "I am protecting you," he corrected, not looking up from the scroll before him. "There is a difference." "Protecting me from what, exactly?" Alira asked, moving closer despite his clear discomfort. "From spending time with someone who cares whether you are eating properly, whether you are sleeping at all? From a fate that has claimed everyone who has grown close to me," he said, finally meeting her eyes. The rawness she had glimpsed earlier had deepened into something closer to desperation. "I cannot watch that happen to you as well, Alira. I would rather bear the loneliness alone than risk your safety." "That is not your decision to make on my behalf," Alira said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. "I understand you carry fear from what has happened before, but you cannot decide for me what risks I am willing to take. You do not understand the full weight of what you are offering," he said, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "Every person who has cared for me has suffered because of it. My parents, Seraphine, even loyal advisors who grew too close, have met untimely ends over the years. I will not add your name to that terrible list." Alira knelt beside his chair, forcing him to look directly at her, rather than retreating into the pages of his old scrolls. "Listen to me carefully, Alaric," she said, using his given name for the first time since she had known him. "I have lost my father to an accident that had nothing to do with curses or fate. I have watched my mother suffer illness that had nothing to do with anyone's love or lack of it. Terrible things happen in this world, regardless of who we choose to care for. Pushing me away will not protect me from misfortune. It will only ensure that whatever happens, you face it entirely alone." He stared at her for a long moment, something fragile shifting behind his careful control. "I do not know how to stop being afraid," he admitted quietly, the confession clearly costing him considerable effort. "I have spent so many years building walls to keep everyone at a safe distance. I am not certain I remember how to lower them without inviting disaster." "Then let me help you learn," Alira said softly. "One conversation at a time, one evening at a time. We do not need to solve everything at once." Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers trembling slightly against hers. "I fear I have already begun to care for you, far more than I intended to allow," he admitted. "It happened despite every precaution I attempted to maintain." "Perhaps some things cannot be prevented through precaution alone," Alira said, her heart pounding at the warmth spreading through her chest at his words. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the tension of recent days slowly easing between them. Though the strange occurrences throughout the castle continued to trouble the staff and stir uneasy whispers among the older pack members, Alira found herself increasingly certain that whatever was happening, it was not the doing of fate or ancient curses, but something else entirely. Something that required a different kind of explanation altogether. She began, quietly and carefully, to pay closer attention to the details of each incident. She noticed that the storeroom infestation had begun shortly after a delivery from a new merchant, one Clara had mentioned hiring due to lower prices than their previous supplier. She learned that the roof collapse had occurred in a section recently inspected by a contractor unfamiliar to the regular castle staff. The dried well, she discovered through careful questioning of the groundskeeper, had coincided with unusual activity near the water source late one evening, activity no one could quite explain. Small threads, easy to dismiss individually, but together forming a pattern that felt far more deliberate than simple coincidence or ancient curse. Alira said nothing of her growing suspicions to Alaric just yet, unwilling to offer false hope before she had gathered more certain evidence. But as she lay awake that night, turning the details over carefully in her mind, she found herself increasingly convinced that someone, somewhere, was working very hard to ensure the legend of the cursed king remained firmly intact, regardless of the actual truth behind these troubling events. The groundskeeper's cottage sat at the far edge of the castle grounds, half hidden behind a row of overgrown hedges. Alira approached it quietly the following afternoon, her heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had spent the morning finishing her duties quickly, eager to continue the quiet investigation she had begun the night before. An older man named Edmund answered her knock, his weathered face registering surprise at finding one of the king's personal attendants standing at his door. "Miss Alira," he said, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. "Is something needed from the grounds?" "I wanted to ask you about the well," Alira said carefully. "The night it ran dry. Did you notice anything unusual nearby?" Any visitors, perhaps? Or activity you did not expect? Edmund's expression grew thoughtful, then slightly troubled. Now that you mention it, I did see lantern light near the water source that evening, well after the household had gone to sleep. I assumed it was one of the guards on a routine patrol, though I did not recognize the shape of the figure clearly enough to be certain. Could you describe anything about them at all? Elira pressed gently. Tall, Edmund said slowly, clearly trying to recall the details. Wearing a guard's cloak, though something about the way they moved seemed unfamiliar. I did not think much of it at the time, given how common such patrols are throughout the grounds. Elira thanked him and continued her careful questioning throughout the following days, speaking quietly with staff members involved in each of the strange incidents, piecing together small fragments of information that others had dismissed too quickly. She learned that the contractor responsible for the roof inspection had been recommended unusually strongly by one particular advisor, a man named Gregory, who served as one of Alaric's closest counselors on matters of pack security. The realization sent an uneasy chill through her chest. Gregory had always struck her as polite, even warm, during their occasional interactions within the castle halls. Yet something about his consistent presence near each troubling incident began to feel increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. She debated for several days whether to share her growing suspicions with Alaric, uncertain whether her evidence was substantial enough to justify accusing one of his most trusted advisors. Eventually, she decided the risk of remaining silent outweighed the risk of being wrong, and sought him out one quiet evening in his private study. "I need to speak with you about something important," she said, closing the heavy door behind her carefully. Alaric looked up from his papers, immediately sensing the seriousness in her tone. "You look troubled. What has happened?" Elira laid out her findings carefully, explaining the pattern she had noticed across each strange incident, the recurring presence of Gregory's influence within circumstances that seemed increasingly deliberate rather than accidental. She watched Alaric's expression shift from initial skepticism to something far more troubled as she continued. "Gregory has served my family since before I was born," he said slowly, though his voice carried clear uncertainty now, rather than outright dismissal. "He served my father loyally for many years. It is difficult to imagine him capable of such deception." "I understand your hesitation," Elira said gently. "I do not make this accusation lightly, but something has felt wrong about these incidents from the very beginning, and every thread I have pulled seems to lead back toward him in some fashion." Alaric sat in silence for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what she had shared. "If what you suspect is true," he said finally, "it would mean the curse that has shaped my entire life, the belief that has kept me isolated for years, was never truly a curse at all, but a lie carefully constructed and maintained." "I cannot yet prove it with certainty," Elira admitted, "but I believe it is worth investigating further before dismissing the possibility entirely." "Why would Gregory wish to convince me of such a curse?" Alaric asked, though the question seemed directed as much toward himself as toward Elira. What purpose would such deception serve him? Elira considered the question carefully. "Perhaps influence," she suggested. "A king who believes himself cursed, who isolates himself from meaningful connection, becomes easier to guide and control through trusted advisors. A king surrounded by love and support, confident in his own judgment, might prove far more difficult to manipulate." The theory settled uneasily between them, neither entirely certain of its truth, yet unable to dismiss its unsettling logic. Alaric rose from his desk and began pacing slowly before the fire, clearly turning years of accumulated grief and fear over in his mind under this new and troubling light. "If this is true," he said finally, "then I have spent years mourning losses that were never truly connected to any curse at all. My parents' illness, Seraphine's death, these might have been nothing more than terrible timing, perhaps even deliberately engineered timing, rather than fate marking me for solitude." "We do not yet know the full truth," Elira cautioned, "but I believe it is worth uncovering, whatever that truth may prove to be." They decided together to proceed carefully, unwilling to confront Gregory directly, without more substantial evidence to support their suspicions. Alaric arranged, through careful and quiet inquiry, to review Gregory's recent correspondence and financial records, tasks usually far outside his direct involvement, but justified now under the guise of routine administrative review. Over the following week, disturbing details began to emerge, Records showed unusual payments to the merchant responsible for the grain delivery that had preceded the storeroom infestation, payments that traced back through several intermediaries to Gregory's own personal accounts. Correspondence revealed private communication with a rival pack leader, a man named Simon, who had long harbored ambitions of expanding his own territory into Blackthorn lands. Communication that suggested a partnership neither party wished to see exposed. The pieces began fitting together with increasing clarity. A weakened, isolated king, convinced of his own cursed fate and unwilling to build strong alliances through marriage or close counsel, would prove far easier for a scheming advisor to influence, particularly if that advisor maintained secret arrangements with a rival pack eager to benefit from Blackthorn's internal instability. Alira found herself both relieved and deeply troubled by these discoveries. Relieved because it meant the shadow of an ancient curse might finally be lifted from Alaric's shoulders. Troubled because it meant someone within these very walls, someone trusted deeply for years, had orchestrated tremendous suffering for entirely selfish and calculated reasons. "We must proceed carefully," Alaric said one evening, as they reviewed the gathered evidence together in his private study. "Gregory holds significant influence among certain factions of the Pack Council. Exposing him carelessly could create dangerous instability, particularly if his rival allies choose to act before we are fully prepared." "What do you propose?" Alira asked. "I propose we gather enough undeniable proof to present before the full council," Alaric said, determination hardening his expression, in a way Alira had not seen since their very first encounter in the moonlit clearing. "If Gregory has indeed manufactured this curse for his own gain, he will answer for it before those he has deceived for so many years." As they continued their careful investigation together, over the following days, something had shifted fundamentally in the dynamic between them. No longer was Alaric simply a lonely king, cautiously allowing himself to care for someone new. He had become, instead, a partner, working alongside Alira toward a shared goal, their growing trust in one another deepening with each piece of evidence they uncovered together. Late one evening, as they finished reviewing another batch of documents by candlelight, Alaric reached across the table and gently took her hand, much as he had during their earlier conversation in the library. "Whatever we discover in the days ahead," he said quietly, "I want you to know that working alongside you these past weeks has given me something I feared I had lost entirely." "What is that?" Alira asked softly. "Hope," he said simply. "Hope that perhaps my life was never truly cursed at all, and hope that perhaps I might yet build something meaningful with someone who has never once feared to stand beside me." Alira felt her chest tighten with emotion at his words, understanding fully now the depth of vulnerability he had allowed himself to show her. "You are not cursed, Alaric," she said firmly. "You have simply been deceived and isolated by someone who profited from your loneliness. That is a very different thing entirely, and one we will prove beyond any doubt." He squeezed her hand gently, and for the first time since she had known him, Alira saw genuine hope shining clearly in his pale gray eyes, unclouded by the fear and grief that had shadowed them for so long. Alira woke, gasping, her throat burning as though she had swallowed fire itself. She stumbled from her bed, knocking over a small table in her disoriented panic, her vision blurring at the edges. Somewhere distant, she heard shouting, footsteps pounding along the corridor outside her quarters, though the sounds seemed to reach her through a thick, suffocating fog. The door burst open, and Nora's frightened face appeared, quickly followed by two guards who lifted Alira between them when her legs refused to support her weight any longer. "Poison," she heard someone say, though the words seemed to come from very far away. "Get the healer immediately." The following hours passed in fragmented pieces for Alira, brief moments of awareness scattered between long stretches of feverish darkness. She remembered bitter medicine forced between her lips, cool cloths pressed against her burning forehead, and once, briefly, Alaric's face hovering above her own, his expression carved from pure anguish, his hand gripping hers so tightly it nearly hurt. "Stay with me," she thought she heard him whisper, though she could not be certain whether the words were real or simply a fevered dream conjured by her struggling mind. "Please, Alira, do not leave me." When she finally woke fully, sunlight streamed weakly through the narrow window of what she recognized as one of the castle's private healing chambers, rather than her own modest quarters. Alaric sat beside her bed, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from what appeared to be a long, sleepless vigil. "You are awake," he said, relief flooding his voice, as he leaned forward immediately. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Illyra managed, her voice hoarse and weak. "What happened?" "Poison," Alaric said grimly. "Someone tainted the tea brought to your quarters last night. The healer believes it was meant to appear as though the curse had claimed another victim close to me." Illyra absorbed this information slowly, her mind still foggy from whatever medicine had been administered to counter the poison. "Gregory," she said finally, understanding dawning despite her weakened state. "We believe so," Alaric confirmed, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury. He must have learned of our investigation somehow. This was meant as both a warning and a demonstration, proof to the Pack Council that the curse remains active and dangerous, undermining our efforts to expose the truth before we could present it properly. "Is he aware you suspect him directly?" Illyra asked, struggling to sit up despite Alaric's gentle attempt to keep her resting. "I do not know for certain," he admitted, "but we cannot afford to wait much longer to act. If he is willing to poison you simply to maintain his deception, I fear what further lengths he might go to protect himself, once he realizes how close we have come to exposing him entirely." Over the following days, as Illyra slowly recovered under the careful attention of the castle healer, Alaric worked quickly and quietly to finalize the evidence needed to present before the full Pack Council. He enlisted the careful assistance of a trusted friend, a loyal enforcer named Daniel, who had served alongside him since childhood, and whose loyalty had never wavered despite years of Alaric's careful isolation from most personal connections. "Gregory grows increasingly nervous," Daniel reported one evening, joining Alaric and a still recovering Illyra in her healing chamber. "My informants within the council report he has begun quietly reaching out to several members, attempting to secure support in case suspicion falls upon him." "Then we cannot delay much longer," Alaric said firmly. "We must present our evidence to the full council before he manages to build enough support to protect himself from consequence." "There is something else," Daniel added carefully, his expression troubled. "Word has reached me that Simon, the rival pack leader Gregory has been corresponding with, has begun moving warriors toward our shared border. It appears they may be preparing for something larger than simple political maneuvering." The news settled heavily over the small gathering. Illyra, still weak from her recent ordeal, felt a fresh chill of fear settle over her despite the warmth of the room. "What does this mean?" she asked quietly. "It means," Alaric said grimly, "that Gregory's ambitions may extend far beyond simply manipulating my personal decisions through fear and isolation. If Simon is preparing military movement, Gregory may be planning something considerably more dangerous than we initially suspected, perhaps intending to weaken Blackthorn's leadership entirely and open the way for an actual invasion." Illyra insisted on attending the council meeting, despite Alaric's clear reluctance to allow her, still recovering, to involve herself in what promised to be a dangerous confrontation. "I have been part of uncovering this deception from its earliest threads," she argued firmly, ignoring the slight tremor still present in her hands from the lingering effects of poison. "I will not simply wait quietly in a healing chamber while you face this alone." Alaric studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her and his growing respect for her determination and courage. "Very well," he said finally. "But you will remain close to Daniel throughout the proceedings. I will not risk your safety further than necessary." The council chamber, when they finally gathered the following evening, felt heavy with tension the moment Illyra stepped through its tall doors, alongside Alaric and Daniel. Gregory sat among the assembled advisors, his expression carefully neutral, though Illyra noticed a slight tightness around his eyes that suggested growing unease beneath his composed exterior. Alaric wasted no time with lengthy preamble, laying out the evidence they had gathered with clear, methodical precision. He presented the financial records tracing suspicious payments back to Gregory's accounts, the intercepted correspondence revealing secret communication with Simon's rival pack, and the timeline connecting each strange incident directly to opportunities Gregory alone had access to arrange. Murmurs of shock and disbelief rippled through the gathered council members as the evidence mounted, undeniable in its careful accumulation. Gregory's composed expression finally cracked, fury and desperation replacing his earlier calm as he realized the full weight of what had been assembled against him. "Lies," he spat, rising sharply from his seat. Fabrications meant to discredit years of loyal service. This girl, he said, gesturing sharply toward Illyra, has poisoned your judgment far more thoroughly than any curse ever could, my lord. The evidence speaks clearly enough on its own, Alaric said, his voice carrying a cold authority Illyra had not heard from him before. Your own correspondence condemns you, Gregory. There is no fabrication required when your own words provide such damning proof. Gregory's composure shattered entirely then, and in a desperate final act, he lunged not toward Alaric, but toward Illyra, a hidden blade suddenly gleaming in his hand. Daniel moved with practiced speed, intercepting him before he could close the distance, wrestling the blade away as several guards rushed forward to restrain the now thoroughly exposed traitor. You will pay for this betrayal, Alaric said, his voice low and dangerous, as guards dragged a struggling Gregory from the chamber, his earlier composure replaced entirely by wild, cornered desperation. As the chaos slowly settled and the council members began processing the shocking revelation that their cursed king had, in fact, been the victim of careful, calculated deception rather than any true supernatural fate, Illyra found herself trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of finally seeing years of manufactured suffering exposed before those who had believed the lie for so long. Alaric moved to her side immediately, his hand finding hers amid the lingering commotion. It is over, he said softly, though his eyes carried a mixture of relief and lingering worry after her narrow escape from Gregory's desperate blade. Not entirely, Daniel interjected grimly, still holding the confiscated weapon. Simon's forces remain at the border, and now that Gregory's plot has been exposed, there is no telling how he might react to losing his inside influence within these walls. The relief of exposing Gregory's betrayal, Illyra realized, had only opened the door to an even more immediate and dangerous threat, one that would require every bit of strength and unity she and Alaric had built together over these past difficult weeks. Horns sounded across the Blackthorn border before the sun had fully risen, sharp and urgent, carrying through the cold morning air with unmistakable warning. Illyra woke to the sound of boots pounding through the castle corridors, guards shouting orders as they rushed toward the outer walls, and she knew immediately that whatever uneasy calm had settled after Gregory's exposure had shattered entirely overnight. She found Alaric already dressed in armor when she reached his chambers, his expression tight with focused urgency as Daniel relayed information from scouts who had returned just before dawn. Simon's forces crossed the border marker an hour ago, Daniel reported grimly. They moved quickly, clearly prepared for this moment for some time. Our eastern watchtowers estimate several hundred warriors, far more than a simple border dispute would typically warrant. He moves now because he knows Gregory's influence within these walls has been severed, Alaric said, fastening the final buckle of his armor with practiced efficiency. He hoped to weaken us gradually through manipulation and fear. Now that path is closed to him. He has chosen open conflict instead. What can I do to help? Illyra asked, refusing to simply stand aside while the castle prepared for what appeared to be genuine warfare. Alaric turned to her, his expression softening slightly, despite the urgency of the moment. The healers will need every capable hand available once fighting begins, he said. Your knowledge of herbs and medicine could prove invaluable in the hours ahead. But Illyra, I need you to remain within the castle walls, away from the fighting itself. I understand, she said, though the fear evident in her voice was not for her own safety, but for his. He crossed the room quickly and took her hands in his armor cold against her palms. Whatever happens today, he said, I need you to know that these past weeks with you have given me more hope and purpose than I believed possible after so many years of isolation. Whatever the outcome of this battle, I do not regret allowing myself to care for you, Illyra, not for a single moment. Do not speak as though this might be a farewell, Illyra said fiercely, fighting back the tears threatening to spill despite her determination to remain strong. You will return to me once this is settled. I refuse to accept any other outcome. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, lingering there for a moment longer than necessary, before pulling back and meeting her eyes with fierce determination. I intend to return, he said firmly. I have far too much to live for now to allow Simon's ambitions to end things here. The battle that followed raged through the better part of the day, visible from the castle's higher windows as clashing forces moved across the open fields beyond the outer walls. Elira worked tirelessly within the healing chambers, alongside the castle's healers, tending to wounded warriors brought back throughout the long hours of fighting, her hands steady, despite the fear gripping her heart with each new arrival. She lost track of time entirely, focused solely on cleaning wounds, preparing poultices, and offering what comfort she could to frightened, injured warriors far from their own families. Nora worked alongside her, having volunteered from the kitchens the moment word of the attack spread through the castle, and the two young women fell into an efficient rhythm, despite the chaos surrounding them. "Any word from the front lines?" Elira asked during a brief lull, wiping sweat and blood from her hands as she prepared for the next wave of wounded. "Nothing certain," Nora said, her own face pale with exhaustion and worry. Only rumors passed between messengers, difficult to trust given the chaos of battle. As afternoon stretched toward evening, a messenger finally arrived at the healing chambers, breathless from running the distance from the outer walls. "The king requests the healers prepare for a larger wave of wounded," he reported. "But he also asks that word be sent to Elira specifically, that the tide has turned in our favor, and Simon's forces are beginning to retreat." Relief flooded through Elira so intensely, her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She forced herself to continue working, unwilling to celebrate prematurely until she could confirm Alaric's own safety with her own eyes. But the news brought a desperately needed measure of hope to the exhausted healing chambers. It was well past sunset when Alaric finally returned, his armor dented and stained, a shallow cut visible along his temple, but alive and largely unharmed despite the intensity of the day's fighting. Elira abandoned her duties the moment she saw him enter the courtyard, rushing forward without regard for the many witnesses gathered around them. "You are safe," she said, her voice breaking with relief as she reached him, her hands searching his face and shoulders, as though needing physical confirmation of his survival. "I am safe," he confirmed, pulling her into an embrace despite his exhaustion, uncaring of who might witness such open affection between them. "Simon's forces have retreated across the border. Daniel believes it will be some time before he attempts such open aggression again, particularly once word spreads of how thoroughly his ambitions have failed." "And Gregory?" Elira asked, pulling back slightly to study his tired but relieved expression. "Held securely until the full council can determine appropriate judgment for his betrayal," Alaric confirmed. "His scheme has cost him everything he hoped to gain. The Pack Council, having seen the truth of his manipulation exposed so thoroughly, will not look kindly upon his crimes." That evening, as the castle slowly settled from the chaos of battle into a cautious, relieved calm, Alaric found Elira once more within his private study, exhaustion evident in both their postures after the long, difficult day. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, settling beside her near the familiar warmth of the fireplace, "about everything that has happened since that first night you crossed the border marker, running through the darkness with nothing but a bag of herbs and desperate hope for your mother's health." "It feels as though a lifetime has passed since then," Elira admitted, leaning gratefully into his side. "A lifetime of discovering that everything I believed about my own fate was built upon careful deception rather than any true curse," he said. "A lifetime of learning that I am capable of love and connection, despite years spent convincing myself otherwise." Elira looked up at him, studying the sincerity evident in his tired gray eyes. "What are you trying to tell me, Alaric?" He took a steadying breath, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw genuine nervousness cross his composed features. "I love you, Elira," he said simply. "Not despite the danger I once feared such feelings might bring, but because you have shown me, time and again, that such fear was never truly justified. You have given me hope where I believed none remained, and courage where I had long since surrendered to isolation." Tears filled Elira's eyes, though this time they carried only joy rather than fear or exhaustion. "I love you as well," she said softly. "I have for some time now, though I did not dare speak such words while uncertainty and danger surrounded us so completely." He pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips, soft and tentative at first, before deepening with the accumulated relief and affection of everything they had endured together. When they finally parted, both were smiling, something neither had allowed themselves fully in far too long. "There is still much to address," Alaric said, though his voice carried none of the earlier weariness, replaced instead by quiet determination. "Gregory's judgment, the lingering threat from Simon's ambitions, the full process of formally clearing my name from years of false legend. But tonight, I find myself simply grateful to have survived this day beside you. As am I, Alira agreed, resting her head contentedly against his shoulder as the fire crackled softly before them, the castle finally settling into peaceful rest after the chaos of the long, difficult day. A guard's frantic pounding on the study door interrupted their quiet peace before the fire, shattering the fragile calm that had settled over the castle following the day's battle. Alaric rose immediately, his instincts sharpening at the clear urgency in the knock. "My lord," the guard said breathlessly upon entering, "Gregory has escaped his holding cell. 2 of his guards were found unconscious near the western passage, and he is nowhere within the castle grounds." Alaric's expression hardened instantly, the brief warmth of the evening replaced by focused alertness. How is this possible? He was to be held under constant watch. "We believe he had help from within, my lord," the guard admitted grimly. "Possibly allies still loyal to him among the staff, individuals who had not yet been identified during our earlier investigation." Alira felt a cold dread settle over her despite the room's warmth. "Where would he go?" she asked. "Surely not toward Simon's territory, not after today's failed attack." "That is precisely where our scouts suggest he has fled," Daniel said, entering the room quickly behind the guard, his expression equally grim. "Though there is troubling news, beyond simply his escape, we have reason to believe he did not flee alone." "What do you mean?" Alaric demanded. Daniel hesitated only a moment before continuing. "One of the healing chamber staff has gone missing as well. We believe Gregory may have taken a hostage, someone he hopes might provide leverage before he reaches the safety of Simon's territory." Alira's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. "Nora," she said quietly, dread creeping into her voice. "She was with me only a few hours ago in the healing chambers." A quick search confirmed her fear. Nora had indeed vanished, sometime during the chaos following the battle's aftermath, likely taken by Gregory as he made his desperate escape toward the border, using her as insurance against pursuit. "We cannot allow him to reach Simon's territory with a hostage," Alaric said, already moving toward the door, his exhaustion from the day's battle forgotten entirely in the face of this new crisis. "Daniel, assemble a small, swift group of our most capable trackers. We move immediately, before he gains too much distance." "I am coming as well," Alira said firmly, refusing to be left behind while her friend's life hung in danger. "Alira, this is far too dangerous," Alaric began, though the protest lacked its usual conviction, clearly aware of her determination after everything they had faced together already. "Nora came to help in the healing chambers because of her connection to me," Alira said. "I will not abandon her now out of concern for my own safety. Besides, I know these grounds and the surrounding forest paths better than most of your trackers, having grown up near this territory my entire life." Alaric studied her for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "Very well, but you remain close to Daniel and myself at all times. I will not risk losing you to Gregory's desperation." The small group set out within the hour, moving swiftly through the darkened forest paths that bordered Blackthorn's territory, following tracks that Daniel's skilled trackers identified leading directly toward the disputed border with Simon's lands. The night air carried a biting chill, though Alira barely noticed it, her focus entirely fixed on the urgent need to reach Nora before Gregory could complete his desperate escape. They found signs of struggle near a small clearing, perhaps 2 hours into their pursuit, broken branches, and disturbed earth, suggesting Gregory's hostage had not gone quietly. Alira's heart raced with a mixture of fear and cautious hope, praying that Nora's resistance meant she remained unharmed, despite the danger of her situation. "They cannot be far ahead now," Daniel said, examining the fresh tracks carefully by torchlight. "Perhaps another hour's travel at most, assuming they have not increased their pace significantly." They pressed forward with renewed urgency, moving as quickly as the darkened forest terrain allowed. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began lightening the eastern sky, they spotted movement ahead through the trees, 2 figures struggling against each other near the very edge of the border marker separating Blackthorn territory from Simon's contested lands. "Gregory," Alaric called out firmly, stepping into the small clearing with Daniel and several guards flanking him protectively. "This ends now. There is nowhere left for you to run." Gregory spun to face them, his earlier composure entirely shattered, replaced by wild desperation, as he gripped Nora tightly by the arm. a small blade pressed against her throat. "Stay back," he warned, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "One more step and I will not hesitate to use this." "Let her go, Gregory," Elira said, stepping forward despite Alaric's sharp intake of breath beside her. "Your scheme has already failed. Harming an innocent girl will not change the judgment awaiting you, but it will certainly make that judgment far harsher." "You do not understand," Gregory said, his eyes wild with desperate fear. "Everything I built, years of careful influence, all destroyed because of your meddling. I have nothing left to lose now." "You still have a choice," Alaric said, his voice calm despite the tension of the standoff. "Release her unharmed, and I will personally ensure your judgment reflects mercy for this moment of restraint. Harm her further, and there will be no mercy remaining for you whatsoever." For a long, tense moment, Gregory seemed to waver, clearly weighing his rapidly diminishing options. Nora, sensing the shift in his grip as his attention wavered slightly, suddenly twisted sharply against his hold, driving her elbow hard into his ribs. The unexpected movement caught him off guard, just long enough for Daniel to close the distance, wresting the blade from Gregory's grip and pulling Nora quickly to safety. Guards moved swiftly to restrain Gregory once more, his brief moment of desperate freedom finally ending as securely as it had begun. Elira rushed to Nora's side immediately, checking her friend carefully for injury, relieved to find only minor scrapes and understandable shock rather than any serious harm. "You are safe now," Elira said, embracing her trembling friend tightly. "It is over, Nora. You are safe." As guards led a thoroughly defeated Gregory back toward the castle for what would surely be his final judgment, Alaric moved to Elira's side, relief evident in every line of his exhausted features. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for insisting on joining us tonight. Your knowledge of these paths, and your courage in facing him directly, may well have saved Nora's life." "We saved her together," Elira corrected gently, though she allowed herself to lean gratefully against him, as the adrenaline of the tense confrontation finally began to fade. The journey back to the castle felt considerably lighter than their urgent pursuit had been, despite the physical exhaustion weighing on the entire group after such a long, difficult day and night. As dawn fully broke over the Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Elira found herself hopeful, for the first time in what felt like ages, that the darkness surrounding Alaric's life might finally be lifting for good. Gregory's final capture, and the subsequent full exposure of his years of careful deception, would need to be addressed formally before the entire Pack Council and community in the days ahead. But for now, as the small group made their way back toward the castle walls in the growing morning light, Elira allowed herself simply to feel grateful and hopeful, and quietly certain that whatever challenges remained ahead, she and Alaric would face them together, as equals bound not by curse or fate, but by genuine hard-won love. The great hall of Blackthorn Castle had not held such a large gathering in many years, every corner filled with pack members from across the territory, drawn by word that their king intended to address the entire community regarding the truth behind years of whispered legend and fear. Elira stood near the front of the assembly beside Daniel and Nora, her heart pounding with anticipation, as Alaric prepared to speak before his people, for the first time since Gregory's final capture. He stood tall upon the raised platform at the front of the hall, his expression composed, despite the significance of what he was about to reveal. The murmuring crowd gradually fell silent as he raised his hand, commanding attention without need for raised voice or forceful demand. "For many years," Alaric began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "you have believed me cursed. You have believed that tragedy follows me, not through simple misfortune, but through some ancient mark placed upon my birth, dooming anyone who dares grow close to me, toward suffering and loss." A murmur rippled through the crowd, old fears and beliefs clearly still deeply rooted, despite recent events. "I believed this myself," Alaric continued. "For the greater part of my life, I isolated myself from meaningful connection, convinced that protecting others meant keeping them at careful distance. I mourned my parents, and later my mate Seraphine, believing their deaths connected to some inescapable fate, tied to my very existence." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. "I have since learned the truth. There was no curse. There was only careful, calculated deception, orchestrated for years by someone I trusted deeply. someone who profited greatly from my isolation and fear. Gasps spread through the assembled crowd as Alaric laid out the evidence methodically, much as he had before the smaller pack council weeks earlier. He explained Gregory's manipulation in careful detail, the financial records connecting him to each staged incident, the secret correspondence with Simon's rival pack, the desperate final attempt to use Nora as a hostage during his failed escape. "The illness that took my parents," Alaric said, his voice steady, despite the personal grief clearly still present beneath his words, "was a natural tragedy, made worse perhaps by poor timing, but entirely unconnected to any curse. Seraphine's death, similarly, was the result of illness that swept through our lands that season, not some mark of fate placed upon me at birth." He looked out over the crowd, meeting eyes that had once averted from his own out of long-held fear. "I understand that years of belief cannot be undone with a single address, however clearly evidenced, but I ask that you consider carefully what I have shared today, and judge me not through the lens of old legend, but through my actions and character moving forward." A long silence followed his words, the crowd clearly processing the significant weight of what had just been revealed. Then, slowly, an older woman near the front of the assembly stepped forward, someone Alira recognized as one of the pack's most respected elders. "My lord," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly despite her advanced age, "I served your father faithfully for many years before his passing. I remember well the fear that spread following his death, fear that Gregory himself helped cultivate among the council in those early days. I confess I have long harbored quiet doubts about the true nature of this so-called curse, doubts I did not dare voice, given how deeply the belief had taken root." Murmurs of agreement rippled through several other older members of the crowd, clearly relieved to finally have permission to voice long-held skepticism, now that the truth had been so thoroughly exposed. "Thank you," Alaric said, genuine emotion evident in his voice for the first time since beginning his address. "Your willingness to reconsider means more to me than you likely realize." As the formal address concluded and members of the pack slowly began dispersing throughout the hall, discussing amongst themselves the shocking revelations they had just witnessed, Alira found herself approached by several staff members and pack members alike, many offering words of gratitude for her role in uncovering Gregory's deception. "You have done our king a great service," the elder woman said, approaching Alira directly with a warm, respectful nod. "Perhaps a greater service than you yet realize, breaking a cycle of fear that has held this pack captive for far too many years." "I could not have uncovered the truth alone," Alira said humbly. "Many people contributed to exposing what Gregory had so carefully constructed." "Perhaps," the woman said with a knowing smile, "but it took someone willing to look past old fear and see the man beneath the legend to begin questioning the truth in the first place. That courage should not be dismissed so easily." In the days that followed, the formal judgment for Gregory's crimes proceeded before the full pack council, with overwhelming evidence leaving little room for leniency, given the severity of his betrayal, particularly his willingness to endanger innocent lives through poison and hostage-taking during his desperate final attempts to escape justice. The council determined he would be permanently exiled from Blackthorn territory, stripped of all rank and privilege, his name forever marked among the pack's history as a cautionary tale of ambition, unchecked by loyalty or honor. News also arrived that Simon, having learned of Gregory's complete exposure and subsequent judgment, had quietly withdrawn any further aggressive intentions toward Blackthorn territory, apparently unwilling to risk further conflict now that his secret ally had been so thoroughly dismantled. Whether this retreat would prove permanent remained uncertain, though Alaric and his advisors began strengthening border defenses regardless, unwilling to leave such matters entirely to chance. Amid the significant political developments unfolding throughout the castle, Alira found herself settling into an entirely new rhythm within Blackthorn's walls, no longer viewed with suspicion or pity by staff members who had once worried for her safety, given her closeness to their supposedly cursed king. Instead, she found herself increasingly respected, even celebrated, among both staff and pack members alike, recognized for the crucial role she had played in finally freeing their leader from years of manufactured isolation and grief. One quiet evening, as autumn began settling firmly over the Blackthorn territory, painting the surrounding forests in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Alaric found Alira walking alone through the castle gardens, enjoying a rare moment of peaceful solitude after the intensity of recent weeks. I have been searching for you, he said, joining her along the quiet garden path, the evening air carrying a crisp chill that hinted at winter's approach. I needed a moment to simply breathe, Elira admitted with a tired smile. Everything has changed so quickly these past weeks. I find myself needing occasional quiet to properly process it all. I understand that need completely, Alaric said, taking her hand gently as they continued walking together beneath the colorful canopy of autumn leaves. Though I confess, I have something further I wish to discuss with you, something that has been on my mind considerably since Gregory's exposure and judgment. What is that? Elira asked, curious at the sudden nervousness evident in his usually composed demeanor. He stopped walking, turning to face her directly beneath the golden light filtering through the garden trees. These past months have shown me, beyond any doubt, that the isolation I once believed necessary for everyone's protection was never truly justified. You have stood beside me through danger, through difficult truth, through battle itself, and you have never once wavered in your courage or your care for me. Elira felt her heart quicken at the sincerity evident in his voice, sensing the significance of whatever he intended to share. Alaric, what are you trying to say? He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped item, his hands trembling slightly, with evident nervousness, despite his usual composure. I love you, Elira, more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of feeling after so many years of careful isolation. I do not wish to spend another day of my life without you fully beside me, not simply as my attendant or even as my closest companion, but as my wife, my equal, and my queen. Tears filled Elira's eyes as he carefully unwrapped the item to reveal a beautifully crafted ring, simple yet elegant, clearly chosen with considerable thought and care. Alaric, she whispered, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion evident in his proposal. You do not need to answer immediately, he added quickly, clearly nervous despite his obvious sincerity. I understand this is significant, and I do not wish to rush you into such an important decision. Yes, Elira said, laughing through her tears as she threw her arms around him without hesitation. Yes, Alaric, I will marry you. I have loved you for longer than I dared admit even to myself, and I cannot imagine building my future with anyone else. He kissed her deeply amid the golden autumn leaves, both of them laughing softly with pure joy, as the weight of recent danger and difficulty finally gave way to genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Whatever challenges remained ahead, whatever adjustments awaited as she prepared to formally join the Blackthorn pack as their future queen, Elira found herself entirely certain, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her future held nothing but hopeful possibility, rather than lingering fear. Snow had begun falling softly over Blackthorn territory by the time the wedding preparations reached their final hurried days, transforming the castle grounds into a landscape of quiet white beauty that seemed to mirror the peaceful transformation the entire pack had undergone since Gregory's exposure months earlier. Elira stood in a small chamber adjoining the great hall, her hands trembling slightly as Clara and Nora helped fasten the final details of her simple yet elegant wedding gown. You look beautiful, Nora said, stepping back to admire her friend with evident emotion. I still remember when you first arrived here, so nervous about simply working in the kitchens. Now look at you, about to become queen of this entire territory. It still feels like a dream sometimes, Elira admitted, studying her reflection in the small mirror Clara held steady before her. I never imagined my life taking such a path when I first crossed that border marker, chasing herbs for my mother's fever. Fate has strange ways of finding the right path, even through the most unlikely beginnings, Clara said warmly, adjusting a final loose strand of Elira's carefully arranged hair. Your mother and brother have arrived safely, by the way. They are already seated within the great hall, along with quite a number of villagers who traveled considerable distance to witness today's ceremony. The news brought fresh tears to Elira's eyes, quickly blinked away before they could disturb the careful work Clara had done. Her mother's health had continued improving steadily over recent months, strong enough now to make the journey to witness her daughter's wedding, an outcome Elira had once feared might never be possible during those difficult early days, when illness had gripped her mother so severely. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Daniel appeared, dressed formally for his role standing beside Alaric during the ceremony. It is time, he said gently. Alaric is understandably nervous, pacing quite a groove into the floor of his private chambers, though I suspect nothing could keep him from this moment, regardless of his nerves. Elira laughed softly, grateful for the moment of levity amid her own nervous anticipation. She made her way toward the great hall, with Nora and Clara close behind, her heart racing, with a mixture of joy and lingering disbelief at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying night running through darkened forest paths months earlier. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with simple, yet elegant arrangements of winter greenery and soft candlelight that cast a warm glow throughout the assembled crowd. Elira paused at the entrance, taking in the sight of so many familiar faces gathered together, staff members alongside pack council members, villagers alongside nobility, all brought together in genuine celebration rather than the fearful distance that had once defined interactions with their supposedly cursed king. Alaric stood waiting at the front of the hall, dressed formally in deep blue and silver, his expression carrying none of the careful, guarded composure she remembered from their very first meeting in that moonlit clearing. Instead, his face held open, unguarded joy, his pale gray eyes finding hers immediately as she began her slow walk toward him through the assembled crowd. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion for Elira, vows exchanged with steady voices despite the significance of the moment. The pack elder who had spoken so bravely during Alaric's earlier address, now leading the formal bonding ritual that would unite them officially, before both their community and the ancient traditions of their people. "By the ancient bonds of this pack," the elder proclaimed, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "and before all gathered as witness, I proclaim Alaric Vane and Elira formally united, no longer separate paths, but one shared future moving forward together." The crowd erupted into genuine celebration as Alaric pulled Elira close for their first kiss, as bonded partners, cheers and applause filling the great hall, with a warmth that had been notably absent during the many years of fearful isolation that had defined Alaric's earlier reign. Elira caught sight of her mother in the crowd, tears streaming freely down her face, and her younger brother beside her, grinning widely, despite his evident awe at the grandeur surrounding him. The celebration that followed stretched long into the snowy evening, filled with music, feasting, and genuine laughter that echoed through castle halls that had known only careful silence and whispered fear for far too many years. Elira found herself pulled into conversation with numerous pack members throughout the evening, many sharing their own quiet relief at finally seeing their king freed from the shadow that had defined his rule for so long. "You have given us something precious today," the elder woman said, finding Elira during a quiet moment amid the ongoing celebration. "Not simply a wedding, but genuine hope that our pack's future holds warmth and connection, rather than continued isolation and fear." "I could not have accomplished any of this without the courage of many people," Elira said humbly, though gratitude for the acknowledgement warmed her considerably. Daniel's loyalty, Nora's friendship, even Clara's careful guidance when I first arrived here nervous and uncertain. This victory belongs to many hands, not simply my own. Later that evening, as the formal celebration began winding down, and guests slowly departed toward their own homes throughout the surrounding territory, Elira found herself standing beside Alaric near the same tall window in his private study, where they had first properly spoken so many months earlier, back when careful distance and fear had defined nearly every interaction between them. "Do you remember?" Alaric said quietly, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders as they gazed out over the snow-covered grounds. "How frightened you looked that very first night, certain my guards intended to end your life for the simple mistake of crossing an old stone marker." "I remember very clearly," Elira said with a soft laugh. "I also remember how surprised I was when you let me go, rather than simply handing me over to whatever fate the legends suggested awaited trespassers." "I surprised myself as well that night," Alaric admitted. "Something about your fearlessness, your refusal to simply cower before me, as everyone else had learned to do, struck something within me I had long believed, thoroughly buried beneath years of isolation." "I am grateful every day that curiosity outweighed caution that night," Elira said, leaning contentedly into his embrace, as snow continued falling softly beyond the window. "As am I," Alaric agreed, pressing a gentle kiss into her hair. "You have given me back a life I believed permanently lost to fear and false legend. You have shown not just myself, but our entire pack, that connection and love need not be feared, but embraced fully, despite whatever uncertainty the future might hold." Outside, the snow continued its quiet descent over Blackthorn territory, blanketing the grounds in peaceful white, while within the castle walls, warmth and genuine celebration continued long into the night. The legend of the cursed Alpha King, whispered fearfully for so many years throughout the surrounding villages, had finally been replaced by a new story entirely, one of a lonely king finally freed from manufactured isolation by the fearless courage and genuine love of a simple village girl who had never once been afraid to see the man behind the legend. As their first night together as formally bonded partners began, Elira felt nothing but quiet, steady certainty about the future stretching ahead of them both. Whatever challenges their shared future might yet bring, she knew now, without any lingering doubt, that they would face them together, bound not by ancient curse or fearful legend, but by genuine partnership, mutual respect, and love that had proven strong enough to overcome even the most carefully constructed deception. The Blackthorn pack, once defined by fear and careful distance from their isolated ruler, began slowly transforming under Alaric and Elira's combined leadership into a community marked instead by openness, genuine connection, and hopeful confidence in the future. And within the castle walls, that had once echoed only with careful silence and whispered legend, laughter and warmth became simply, finally, the new and lasting truth.